"This man lived with me," Victoria screamed, frozen in shock. In front of her stood a homeless man, dirty and hungry, extending his hand in search of spare change. It was Paul, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had vanished without a trace years ago, as if he had never existed. She never imagined finding him there, abandoned on the streets while she had been building an empire. What had happened to him? How had he fallen so low? And why, after all this time, did he still have the same eyes of someone she could never forget? Before we dive back into this touching story, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Now, let's continue the story. Victoria, a successful entrepreneur with a life filled with luxury and accomplishment, had everything most people could only dream of. Her days were spent in boardrooms, making multi-million-dollar deals, attending glamorous events, and enjoying the comfort that wealth could offer. Her penthouse apartment in the heart of New York, with its breathtaking view of the skyline, was a constant reminder of how far she'd come. She had built an empire from scratch, and nothing seemed impossible. But despite the outer beauty of her life, there was always a shadow lurking beneath. A memory that haunted her, one she couldn't escape. The memory of Paul, the man she had once loved, the man who had disappeared without a trace. Their love had been intense, passionate, and everything a young couple could dream of. They had plans, dreams, and a future. Paul was her equal in every way, driven, ambitious, and full of life. They had built a world together, but in a cruel twist of fate, that world shattered when Paul vanished without a word. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Victoria never fully recovered from the loss. She spent years searching for him, hiring private investigators, contacting old friends and associates, but it was as if he had never existed. Her heart, though full of achievements and material wealth, was never whole. She moved on, of course. She had no choice. But Paul's absence was a void she could never fill. It was a cold, dreary day when it happened. Victoria had just finished a meeting, feeling the weight of yet another successful deal hanging over her shoulders. She stepped out of her sleek black SUV, adjusting her sunglasses, prepared to head back to her office. The streets were busy with the usual hustle of New York City: tourists, office workers, street vendors. But as she walked, something unusual caught her eye. There, standing on the corner of the street, was a man, dirty and disheveled, holding out a cup for change. His clothes were torn, his face unshaven, and his hair matted. The sight was not unusual in a city like New York, where the homeless were a constant presence. Yet there was something about this man that made Victoria stop dead in her tracks. She couldn't explain why, but she found herself drawn to him, her eyes locking onto his. And then, as if struck by lightning, it hit her. The unmistakable familiarity in his eyes. The way he stood, his posture. The way he looked at her. It was Paul. There was no mistaking it. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it really be him? After all these years? After everything she had endured? Was Paul really standing there before her, begging for money on the streets of New York? She blinked, convinced she was imagining things, but as her eyes filled with tears, she knew the truth. "Paul," she whispered under her breath, as if the mere sound of his name could make him reappear from the shadows of her past. Then, without warning, she screamed, "Paul!" The people around her paused, confused by her outburst. But Victoria didn't care. All she could focus on was the man standing before her, his face now showing a mixture of recognition and confusion. The moment was surreal. How had it come to this, she thought? Her mind raced, unable to comprehend the overwhelming emotions flooding her. There he was, the man who had once been her world, standing in front of her as a stranger, living on the streets, lost in the abyss of a life she could never have imagined for him. This was not the reunion she had dreamed of. It wasn't the moment of joy, the embrace, the answers she had longed for. It was a cruel twist of fate, a slap in the face of everything she had built. And yet, there he was. The shock was too much for Victoria to process. She stood frozen, unable to move, to speak, to comprehend what had just unfolded in front of her. The world around her seemed to blur as the past and present collided in a way she could never have anticipated. But this moment, this encounter, was only the beginning. And what came next would shake both of them to the core. Victoria stood there, frozen in disbelief, her mind racing as the chaotic sounds of the city swirled around her. The weight of the moment crushed her chest as she stared at Paul. He was here right in front of her, but not the man she remembered. The years had taken their toll, and his appearance was the starkest reminder of how far he had fallen. It seemed impossible. How had it come to this? How had the man she had once shared everything with, love, dreams, and a future, ended up here, on the streets, begging for coins like any other homeless person? Her hands trembled as she tried to gather her thoughts. She stepped forward, unsure whether she wanted to run to him, scream, or simply walk away. The love she had once felt for him stirred inside her like a sleeping giant, waking up in the midst of shock and confusion. But the question that consumed her the most was why. Why had he disappeared without a word? It all began 5 years ago. Victoria and Paul had met in a small cafe in Manhattan, both in the prime of their lives. She had just graduated from business school, eager to make a name for herself. Paul, an ambitious, driven man with dreams of starting his own tech company, had crossed her path. Their connection was instant, magnetic. They spent hours talking about their futures, sharing their dreams and planning a life together. Paul was everything Victoria had ever wanted. He was kind, intelligent, and shared her passion for success. Together they made plans for the future, marriage, a family, and the shared goal of building something big. For a time it felt like nothing could stand in their way. They were the perfect couple, supporting each other, encouraging each other. As their relationship deepened, Victoria's business took off. She secured investors, launched her own marketing agency, and before long, she was making a name for herself in the industry. But as her success grew, so did the pressure. The demands of running a business began to consume her, and soon she found herself spending more time in meetings and less time with Paul. Paul, on the other hand, was struggling to launch his company. The pressure to succeed weighed heavily on him, and it began to affect his mental health. Victoria noticed the change in him. He was distant, withdrawn, and secretive. He stopped talking about his dreams, stopped sharing his hopes. Instead, he became consumed with what felt like failure. The man she had once known was slipping away, and she couldn't seem to reach him. One evening, after a long day at work, Victoria came home to find an empty apartment. Paul's things were gone, his clothes, his personal items, everything. There was no note, no explanation, no clue as to where he had gone or why. He had simply disappeared. Victoria tried to reach him, countless phone calls, emails, even a few visits to places he used to frequent. But there was nothing. No one had seen or heard from him. The disappearance was as sudden as it was mysterious. The woman who had everything, success, wealth, love, was left with nothing. The unanswered questions, the pain of abandonment, consumed her. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. She hired private investigators, but all their efforts yielded nothing. Paul had vanished without a trace, as if the world had swallowed him whole. At first, she convinced herself that he had left her because he couldn't handle the pressure. Maybe he had given up on their dreams. Maybe he was ashamed. But as time passed, the doubts crept in. The uncertainty gnawed at her soul. She couldn't let go, couldn't accept that someone she had loved so deeply could just disappear. It was a painful time in Victoria's life. She threw herself into her work to cope with the loss. She focused on building her business, on making sure her success remained undisturbed. But despite the wealth, the recognition, and the respect she had earned, there was always a void inside her. She often wondered where Paul was, what had happened to him. The love they had shared felt like a lifetime ago, but the pain of losing him had never fully healed. And now, standing before her, was the man she had once loved, broken, lost, and living on the streets. As Victoria stood there gazing at Paul, memories of their time together flooded her mind. The late-night talks, the laughter, the way they had dreamed about their future. She remembered the way he had looked at her with such hope, with such love. But what happened? What had torn them apart? Victoria didn't know the answers, but she was determined to find out. She had built a successful empire from the ground up, but now it was time to face the past. Time to confront the man she had lost, the love that had vanished, and the mysteries that had remained buried for so long. Taking a deep breath, she stepped closer to Paul, her heart pounding in her chest. "Paul," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "What happened to you? Where did you go?" For the first time in years, she was no longer the powerful businesswoman. She was just a woman who wanted answers, who needed closure. But as Paul looked at her, his eyes seemed to betray something deeper. A sorrow, a secret, something that he was not ready to reveal. The story was far from over. The street was a harsh reality, one that Victoria had never truly understood until now. Standing before her, the man who had once shared her dreams and her future was nothing more than a shadow of the person he used to be. The clean-cut businessman, the confident, ambitious entrepreneur, had been replaced by this ragged, disheveled figure, asking for spare change on a street corner. Victoria could hardly process it. She had expected to find him somewhere, maybe working a low-level job or living in some forgotten corner of the city. But this was a fate worse than she could have imagined. The disparity between the life he had once led and the one he was now living was staggering. How had it all gone so wrong? As she watched Paul stand there lost in the crowd, she couldn't help but wonder about the years in between, the years she had spent trying to move on, and the years he had spent surviving on the streets. What had happened to him? How did a man who had once had everything end up with nothing? Paul had never been the type of person to give up easily. He had always been determined, focused, and driven. So what could have broken him? Victoria needed to know. She couldn't leave the answers to her past buried in the uncertainty of his disappearance. She had to find out. Over the next few days, Victoria made it her mission to track down Paul. She couldn't rest until she understood what had happened. She hired a private investigator, although she knew the streets held more secrets than any detective could uncover. The investigator found nothing. No one knew where Paul had been or what had led him to his current life. As the days turned into weeks, Victoria began visiting the street corner where she had first seen him. At first it felt absurd, coming back to the same place, as though, this time, he would have the answers. But each time she visited, he was there. He didn't recognize her. He barely even acknowledged her presence. His eyes were empty, like a man who had long since lost hope. Each day, Victoria observed him from a distance. She saw how he interacted with the other homeless individuals in the area, how they seemed to know each other, exchanging silent nods and words, forming their own community within the harsh reality of the streets. Paul was just another part of it. His existence was a grim reflection of the life he had once known. But now, he was only a name in the wind, a ghost of the man he used to be. It was clear that he was living day by day, relying on the charity of strangers, with no plans, no future. The ambition and drive that once fueled his every move were nowhere to be found. Paul had disappeared not just from Victoria's life but from life itself. There was no indication of what had happened to him after his disappearance. No job, no apartment, no friends. Just the life of a homeless man. Victoria couldn't fathom it. The Paul she had known would never have let this happen. He would never have given up on himself, on them. But then, the thought crossed her mind. Maybe he hadn't given up. Maybe life had given up on him. In one of her visits, she approached him. He was sitting against a brick wall, his back hunched, eyes closed as though trying to block out the world. The man who had once held her hand and promised her a future was now a mere shell of himself. His clothes were tattered, his face covered in a scruffy beard, and his hands shook as he reached for the cup of coins people had tossed at his feet. Victoria approached slowly. almost afraid of the reaction she would get. She didn't know if he would recognize her, if he would even speak to her. But as she stood there just a few feet away, he opened his eyes. And for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, just a brief flash of something familiar. But it was gone in an instant. "Spare some change?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. Victoria's heart sank. This wasn't the man she remembered. This wasn't the confident, passionate Paul who had once believed in the future. This was a man who had been broken, shattered by forces far beyond his control. "I don't have much," Victoria said softly, her voice trembling. She had expected anger, perhaps resentment. Instead, she was met with indifference. Paul didn't seem to care. He wasn't the man who had loved her. He wasn't the man who had promised to build a life together. Victoria couldn't help but wonder, what happened to him? What caused the man she had loved to fall so far? As she continued to visit, she started to learn bits and pieces of Paul's story. She would ask around, talk to the other homeless people, try to piece together the puzzle of his life. What she uncovered was more heartbreaking than she could have imagined. It turned out that Paul hadn't disappeared by choice. There had been an accident, one that left him in a coma for months with no family or friends to help him. The trauma from that accident had shattered his mind, his ability to function normally. He had been homeless for years, drifting from shelter to shelter, trying to hold on to whatever semblance of his former self remained. But it wasn't enough. The trauma had left him hollow, unable to cope with the world around him. Victoria had never known. She had spent years thinking that Paul had abandoned her, but the truth was far more complicated. He hadn't left her. Life had simply stolen him away. As Victoria learned the details of his life on the streets, she realized that she couldn't judge him. She couldn't blame him for what had happened. The world had broken him in ways she couldn't understand. The strong, ambitious man she had known was lost, but not by choice. He was a victim of circumstance, a man caught in a web of fate that he couldn't escape. But despite all of this, Victoria still held on to the hope that somewhere beneath the layers of pain and despair, Paul was still there. She just had to find him. Victoria's heart weighed heavy as she stood there, contemplating the man before her. The ghost of the man she had loved, standing in front of her, was now something else, someone broken, lost in the endless swirl of life's cruel twists. For a moment, all she could hear was the muffled sounds of the street, the distant chatter of strangers passing by, the clatter of traffic, and her own heartbeat, pounding in her chest. She stood frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming mix of emotions that surged through her. Anger, sadness, confusion, but mostly a deep and aching sense of loss. She had thought, after all these years, that she had moved on. She had built her life, an empire by most measures. But here he was in front of her, not as the man she had known and loved, but as someone completely different. The man she had dreamed of, the man who had once held her in his arms and promised a future together, was no longer the same person. He had been replaced by this hollow version of himself. And as much as she wanted to pull him back into the life they had once shared, she knew that wasn't possible. Things had changed. Time had changed them both. "Paul," she whispered, trying to steady her voice. "Why didn't you tell me what happened? Why didn't you let me help you?" Paul's eyes flickered with something, regret, maybe. But the spark that had once been there was gone. He looked at her for a moment, as if seeing a ghost from the past, and then looked away. He couldn't face her. Not now. Not with all the guilt and shame that haunted him. Victoria took a step closer, her heart aching for the man she had once known. The past seemed so distant yet so present. She was standing here in front of him trying to reach out, but there was a wall between them, a wall built by years of silence, by pain and regret. "I thought you were dead, Paul," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you had just disappeared from my life, like you didn't care anymore." He looked up at her, his face softening, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I didn't disappear, Victoria. I was lost. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to come back." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of absence. Victoria didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long wondering why he had left, why he hadn't fought for her, for them. But now, hearing his voice again, hearing him say those words, something shifted inside her. Paul continued, his voice hoarse and filled with emotion. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how to fix myself, how to find my way back. I thought I could handle it, but the more I tried, the worse it got. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. The pain she had carried for so long began to surface, and she felt the weight of all the years lost. Years she had spent in uncertainty, not knowing whether he was dead or alive, not knowing whether she would ever get the answers she had longed for. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. Why didn't you let me help you? I would have done anything to be there for you. Paul's face contorted with guilt, and he looked down at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. I didn't want to drag you into my mess. I didn't want you to see me like this. I couldn't face you. I thought it was better this way. I thought you'd be better off without me. Victoria's heart broke as she listened to him. The man she had once known, strong, confident, and full of life, was now a man consumed by his own guilt. A man who had isolated himself from the world because he couldn't face the shame of what had happened to him. You don't get it, do you? She said softly, taking a step back. I would have been there for you. I wanted to be there for you. We could have figured it out together. The silence between them was thick with unsaid words. Both of them were broken, in different ways, but they were standing in front of each other, finally face to face after all these years. It wasn't the reunion Victoria had imagined. There were no embraces, no tears of joy. Instead, there was only the harsh reality of the past, the weight of all the time lost, and the difficult truth of what had happened to Paul. Victoria could see it now, how much Paul had changed, how much life had worn him down. And yet, despite everything, there was still a flicker of the man she had loved. It wasn't gone. It couldn't be. I don't know what's going to happen next, she said, her voice low. But I'm not going to leave you here, Paul. Not again. Paul looked up at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. You'd still want to help me? After everything? Yes, she said firmly, her heart determined. You're not a lost cause, Paul. We've both been lost, but that doesn't mean we have to stay that way. For a moment, they just stood there, the sounds of the city continuing to bustle around them. And then, for the first time in years, Paul allowed himself to believe, perhaps just for a moment, that there was still a chance for redemption, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Victoria extended her hand toward him, a simple gesture of support, of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the past begin to lift. There was still time. There was still hope. The silence that hung between Victoria and Paul was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time in years, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were both standing on the edge of something. But what that something was, neither of them could say for sure. They had both been lost for so long, disconnected from each other and from the world around them. But now, there was a chance to find their way back. Victoria, determined to understand the full scope of what had happened to Paul, knew that this moment, the moment they finally spoke about the past, was crucial. But she didn't know where to begin. So much had been left unsaid, so much was still shrouded in mystery, and yet, as they stood in front of each other, Paul seemed to sense the need for answers. I owe you the truth, Paul said quietly, his voice raspy and burdened with the weight of all the years spent in silence. His gaze was steady but distant, as if he were seeing the past unfold before him. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. The truth. The one thing she had longed for. But how much of it would she be ready to hear? Paul took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for the words that were about to spill out. You don't know everything that happened to me after I left. I thought I could start over, that I could fix things. But it didn't work like that. Victoria didn't interrupt, though her mind raced with questions. She had spent so long wondering why he disappeared. She had thought of every possible scenario. Maybe he didn't love her anymore. Maybe he had been hiding something from her. But never once did she imagine this. Paul continued, his words slow and deliberate. After I left, things went wrong so quickly. I thought I was escaping, starting fresh, but I didn't realize how broken I was, how much the weight of everything had destroyed me. My business failed. My health deteriorated. I lost everything, including myself. Victoria listened intently, feeling a wave of sorrow for him. She had known that Paul had been struggling before he disappeared, but this was far beyond what she had imagined. I thought I could pull myself together, but it just kept spiraling. I hit rock bottom, and I couldn't get out. I lost touch with everyone, including you. The guilt of leaving you, I couldn't face you. I couldn't face anyone. I felt like I had failed. The world just crushed me. He paused, looking away for a moment. And then I had the accident. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The accident. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The truth about why Paul had disappeared. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling. Paul's expression darkened, and his eyes seemed to cloud with pain as he relived the memory. It was a car crash. I don't even remember much about it. I woke up in the hospital, alone. I had no one there. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I didn't feel anything. My body was broken, but it was my mind that was the real casualty. The weight of his words sank into Victoria's chest, and her mind raced to process the information. He had been in an accident. He had nearly died, and all that time she had been thinking he had abandoned her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. I couldn't tell you because I couldn't face what I had become," Paul replied, his voice thick with regret. "I was ashamed. I thought you'd be better off without me. I didn't want to drag you into my mess." Victoria's heart broke as she heard him say those words. She had spent years wondering, hoping and imagining reasons for his disappearance. But the truth was far more tragic than she had ever imagined. "I never stopped thinking about you," Paul added, his voice quieter now. "But I thought I didn't deserve you. I thought you would hate me if you knew everything that happened." The emotions were overwhelming. All the years of anger, confusion, and hurt seemed to vanish in an instant as Victoria listened to Paul's confession. It wasn't that he had chosen to leave her. It wasn't a matter of him not caring. It was the sheer force of life's cruelty that had torn him apart, and he had been left to pick up the shattered pieces alone. Victoria reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on his. For a moment there was silence, but it was a peaceful silence, the kind that only comes when two people understand each other fully. She had wanted answers, and now she had them. But even with the truth, there was still so much left to understand. "I wish you had told me," she whispered, her voice full of pain and compassion. "I would have been there for you, Paul. You didn't have to do this alone." "I didn't know how to ask," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "I didn't know how to come back from the mess I had made. I didn't want to drag you into my failure." Victoria shook her head slowly. "You didn't fail me, Paul. We both had our own battles, but we could have faced them together. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating." Victoria finally understood what had happened to Paul. It wasn't a matter of him abandoning her, but rather him being lost in a world that he couldn't control. He had fought battles in silence, thinking that he had to face them alone. But now, here they were, two broken people, finding a way to face the past and perhaps build a new future. "I'm sorry," Paul whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I need you to know the truth." Victoria looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "You don't need to apologize. We both have our scars, but we're still here." And in that moment she realized that despite everything, Despite the pain, the lost years, the brokenness, there was still a chance. It wouldn't be easy, but it could be worth it. There was still hope, even after all the darkness. The street corner where they stood was no longer just a place of sorrow for Victoria. It was a moment of reckoning. The weight of the past, which had been buried in pain, regret, and unanswered questions, was slowly lifting. She had spent so many years believing the worst, believing Paul had abandoned her without reason, that their love had been meaningless. But now, the truth was unraveling, and with it, a new understanding was taking shape. As Victoria stood there, holding Paul's hand in hers, she realized how much of her life had been shaped by the absence of answers. For years, she had thought that the pain of losing him was something she had to bear alone. But now, seeing the man she had once loved in front of her, it was clear that they both had suffered. They had both been lost, each in their own way. The city around them continued its chaotic, relentless pace, but in that moment, time seemed to stand still. For the first time in years, Victoria was no longer rushing. She was no longer trying to outrun the past, to distract herself with work and success. She was facing it head-on, looking at the man who had once been her world, and seeing not just the broken version of him in front of her, but the man he had once been. The questions that had plagued her for so long began to fade into the background as she processed the enormity of what Paul had endured. The shame, the pain, the trauma. He had suffered in ways she could never have imagined. And as she listened to him, something shifted within her. She couldn't change the past, but she could change how she responded to it. She could choose to face the future with him, not as a way to undo the hurt, but as a way to build something new. "I don't know what comes next," Paul said quietly, his voice uncertain, almost hesitant. "I don't know if I deserve anything more. I don't even know if I deserve your forgiveness." Victoria looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. "Paul, I'm not here to forgive you. I'm here because I still care. I always have." The words were simple, but they were powerful. For the first time in years, Victoria didn't feel the need to carry the weight of the past. The guilt, the anger, the confusion, they were no longer the driving forces in her life. She had let go of them, and in doing so, she had freed herself to make a choice. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were," Victoria continued, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm willing to try to understand what comes next. We've both been through so much, and maybe we can find a way forward together." The hope in her voice was genuine, but it was also tempered with realism. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There was so much that had been broken between them, so much that needed to be healed. But for the first time, there was a spark of possibility, a spark that had been dimmed for so long, but now in the presence of this man, this broken man who had once been her whole world, she could see it flicker back to life. Paul's face softened as he processed her words. He had always known that Victoria was strong, but this was something he hadn't expected. She had every right to walk away, to leave him behind in the streets where she had found him, but instead, she was offering him something far more precious than forgiveness. She was offering him a chance. "I don't know how to do this," Paul said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I don't know how to fix everything I've broken, but I want to try. I want to try to make it right." Victoria nodded, squeezing his hand gently. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." And that was all they could do, one step at a time. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but they were also filled with the quiet promise of something new. Victoria didn't know where this road would lead them, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She didn't need to know everything right away. She didn't need to fix all the broken pieces in a single moment. All she needed was to give herself permission to be present with Paul, and present with the life they could still build together, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. In the weeks that followed, they started rebuilding, piece by piece. Paul, with Victoria's support, began to work on himself. He sought therapy to deal with the trauma that had plagued him for years. He started to regain his confidence, his sense of self. It wasn't easy. It never would be. But with each day, there was progress. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, there was a sense of hope. Victoria, too, had changed. The successful, driven woman who had once been consumed by her career now found herself looking at life through a different lens. She had spent so much of her life running from the pain of the past, but now she was learning how to face it. She was learning that healing didn't happen overnight, and that love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, about being there for each other when it mattered most. As they walked this new path together, hand in hand, they both knew that the journey was just beginning. There would be struggles, there would be setbacks, but there would also be growth. And maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to something that was even better than what they had once shared. But that was a story for tomorrow. For today, they had each other. And that was enough. The days were slowly turning into weeks, and as time passed, Victoria and Paul found themselves navigating the uncharted waters of their new reality. They had shared so much in the past, the love, the dreams, the plans. And now, they were forced to face the remnants of what they had lost, trying to rebuild something that had once seemed impossible to regain. For Victoria, the most challenging part was accepting that healing wasn't linear. There were good days when it felt like everything was falling into place, when Paul made progress, when they laughed together, and when their shared past no longer felt like a distant memory, but a part of the future they were trying to create. But there were also hard days, days filled with frustration, confusion, and the overwhelming weight of the time that had been lost. It was difficult for her not to look at the life she had built and wonder what it would have been like if things had been different. If Paul hadn't disappeared, if they hadn't drifted apart. But as she watched Paul work on himself, piece by piece, it became clear to her that their relationship wasn't about returning to what they had. It was about building something new from the ashes of the past. And although that path was far from easy, it was the only one that felt right. Paul, on the other hand, had never expected the road ahead to be so difficult. Every step he took felt like a monumental effort. The guilt weighed heavily on him every time he looked at Victoria. He knew he had failed her. He knew he had broken something sacred between them. But as time went on, he began to understand that redemption wasn't about fixing everything in one fell swoop. It was about taking responsibility, showing up every day and trying to make things right one small step at a time. For Paul, there were moments of clarity, moments when he felt like he was finally starting to regain a sense of control over his life. The therapy was helping, the support from Victoria was invaluable, and the hope that had once seemed so distant now felt more tangible. But there were also setbacks, times when he would relapse into old patterns of thinking, times when the pain of the past would resurface, threatening to undo all the progress he had made. But with each setback, he learned how to move forward, how to acknowledge his mistakes and keep going. One afternoon, as the sun was setting over the city, Victoria and Paul sat together on the rooftop of her apartment building, watching the golden light spill over the skyline. It was a moment of peace, a rare moment when the chaos of their past seemed to fade into the background, if only for a little while. Victoria turned to Paul, her eyes soft, her expression reflective. "You know, I've spent so many years thinking that we were both broken beyond repair," she said, her voice gentle. "I thought that I had moved on, that I had to move on, that there was no going back. But now, I realized that maybe we weren't broken. Maybe we were just waiting for the right moment to heal." Paul looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't deserve you, Victoria. I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. I can't promise that I'll get it all right, but I promise that I'll try." Victoria smiled softly, her hand resting on his. "That's all I need. You don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to keep trying. Together." And as the days went on, they did. They kept trying. They worked through their struggles. They supported each other through their setbacks, and they found new ways to grow together. It wasn't easy, and it never would be. But there was something deeply comforting in the knowledge that they were facing the future side by side. Victoria still had her doubts, of course. She still wondered what the future would hold for them, whether they could truly rebuild what had been lost. But with each passing day, she began to trust more in the journey. She had spent so many years holding on to the past, thinking that it defined her, defined them. But now she realized that it was the future, the road ahead, that mattered most. The mistakes, the regrets, the guilt. They were all part of the story, but they didn't have to define the ending. For Paul, the path to redemption was just beginning. There were days when the weight of his past would feel unbearable, and there were moments when he doubted himself, when he questioned whether he was worthy of a second chance. But every time he looked at Victoria, every time he saw the kindness and forgiveness in her eyes, he was reminded that redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about making the choice to try, again and again, even when the odds seemed impossible. And so they continued their journey, not knowing what the future held, but knowing that for the first time in a long time, they were no longer alone. Together, they faced the unknown, one step at a time. As the months passed, their relationship deepened in ways neither of them had expected. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had both learned to let go of the past and embrace the possibilities of the future. And in doing so, they discovered something they had both longed for, the chance to build a new life, together. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next ones. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the choices made by the characters? Do you agree with how things unfolded, or would you have done something different? Drop your opinion in the comments below.